Okay, we are now recording. So this lecture is called Coding Best Practices. So we are going to dive into some of the details of what are really some of the best practices, not just with individual aspects of code, some people call that syntax, but also just the process. So right now we're going to focus mostly on what is the process behind which you would code your individual MVP or prototype. But before we dive into that, I do want to talk a little bit about what an MVP is. So lean startup reading. I got some great answers from you all. And so I've got some questions that before we dive into lecture slides, I'd like to have a little bit of a conversation about. So let me just bring up, because I had some of your answers. They're really good answers. Okay, so who would like to go first? Talk a little bit about your example of what would an MVP look like that you were to design. I think one interesting thing, we had two people who submitted videos. So, or didn't submit videos, but submitted that their MVP would be a video. So I think that was Scott and Danny. So if you guys wouldn't mind talking a little bit about why you chose a video and how you think that might be applicable and what are some of the pros as well as the cons to doing that.
Yeah, so I chose a video for mine. I was kind of following that Dropbox example from the reading. And I think a good thing about a video is like it's basically like short and sweet, it gets to the point, and it definitely shows like the potential customers, this is what the product could look like. It's a very easy way of doing that. So I talked about Netflix and how in the beginning, Netflix, you'd like go online and you'd get DVDs sent to your house. So I just kind of explained like what the video would look like based on that.
And you can imagine Netflix as a company would be a very intimidating business to try to start up and compete with on your own, right? I mean, you all remember Quibi, I'm sure, at least the talks about Quibi, right? Here you have two billionaires that are trying to compete and just absolutely fell on their face. So not easy, but if you start simple, and like you said, back in the day, they started with just delivering DVDs door to door, and having a video to show someone this compelling pitch could be a good way to do it. Danny, any thoughts from you about, actually, yeah, Danny's here. Any thoughts from you about what are some of the advantages of a video?
Yeah, so for the company I chose, it's called Discord, which is essentially like another messaging or social media kind of program. And I chose a video just because compared to the other approaches, how Scott already mentioned Dropbox, I chose video because it would highlight all of the functions that Discord provides. And trying to provide that to people through like a free trial or other ways wouldn't necessarily benefit them that much, because Discord is something that I think that people wouldn't realize could be beneficial to their life, just because they have other things like Facebook or Instagram or other social media platforms where they can kind of interact and with others and things like that. But then Discord kind of, in my opinion, jumbles or bunches it all up together into one kind of program. And so that's why I chose the video, because we essentially just be able to highlight all the functions that it'd be able to provide.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that really struck me is that at the very beginning you said it's just another messaging app, right? And so that might be the perception from someone. And so a video enables you to control the messaging in that sense and say like, hey, this is not just another messaging app. It's got these different appeals, or this is where current messaging apps are broken and where Discord wants to insert itself to become a player. And obviously we've seen that where Discord, and I don't think that much amount of time has really become a major player in the messaging app space. And then you also could see that with Netflix, right? Where you see that, oh, well, Blockbuster is broken because they make all their money off of late fees, and because you didn't rewind your tape, which I don't know if that resonates with anyone here. But that that was a big aspect of how they made their money, and also why people hated it. And so you can talk about there must be a better way, and there is. And some of the advantages, of course, are speed and the ability to get that in front of potential users or potential customers. And I think you both highlighted that. You can get that in front of them and get responses, right? That they might say, oh, I don't need another app for messaging. Or, hey, that thing you told me that Discard does that these other apps don't do, that really resonates with me. Wouldn't it be cool if you also did this, that, and the other? And so then you can start using that user feedback to build a much better product, because there's definitely a lot of developers, they get caught in this mode of, or even companies, they get caught in this mode of, we've got to get this perfect within our four walls before we release it into the wild. And I think getting a video out there could be a good way to get that message out there in the wild and see how the wild reacts. What are some of the disadvantages of videos? And this could either be you guys, or if anyone else wants to speak up, since obviously the others didn't choose video. What might be some of the disadvantages?
It might not just seem appealing to the audience, I guess. Like, there are certain people who would rather have like that firsthand experience where they like to test it out, as opposed to just seeing a video and just looking at it through that. They rather just experience it themselves.
Yeah, totally. I typically, and this might be more my style of learning, but when I try to learn about a company, I'll scroll through their site, and if there's a video, I'll sort of highlight over it. And if I see that it's more than 2 minutes, I'm like, I don't have time for that. So sometimes people just might not be interested in clicking it. What else?
Sometimes I feel like the products are a little more hands-on, so it might work with something of like a Discord or a Netflix, but it doesn't work as much if you have like a hands-on product, which mine was specifically with like Apple. So you would have to kind of do some of those kind of different focus rooms where you're actually physically handling the product.
Yeah, definitely. I think some businesses are more about an idea, and an idea that is very clear to people. And I think that with Netflix and Discord, that really resonates. People can understand why this would be appealing, but other things, they might be too abstract. You just have to experience it to understand. iPhone is a good example where it's hard to explain to someone why they should love the iPhone before the iPhone was there. It's just kind of needed people to get their hands on it and then tell their friends like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's a computer in my pocket. And also along those lines, you have to overcome doubt. People say like, no, you can't put a computer in your pocket. There's no way. Or they've seen earlier versions that didn't work. And so they're biased. And so really they have to get their hands on it to get that magical feeling. Another disadvantage is that if you're pitching to investors, a video just might not be enough. If you are someone who is already a successful entrepreneur, then you might already have people who are just ready to jump onto your next venture, and a video would help. And I think Drew Houston was not that, but he had a reputation already in the developer community. And so by posting that video, he was able to get that to go viral. So I guess one question you would ask is, if you created the video, would anyone watch it? Or would it just be your mom? And I think that's a good question as to whether or not a video is going to accomplish what you needed to accomplish.
Well, I was just going to say, like, an advantage of a video, though, is the shareability of it, is that you don't have to be physically in the same room. You could send it over to someone who's over on the East Coast or the West Coast if you're kind of not that local to them, and it could potentially go viral, and that can make it go a little bit longer.
For sure. Absolutely. And so I think your ability to succeed is going to be a combination of how tangible what you've got is. And a video is a little bit on the less tangible side, right? You haven't built anything yet. It's still more in the idea phase. And then how many people want it? And a video can be very effective for the latter, right? You could have a lot of people very quickly saying, I want this. if you share video in the right place and it resonates with the right people. And so the combination of those things, right? How real is what you have and how many people want it are typically what an investor is going to look like. And so a video like really hits that latter part on the head in terms of getting it in front of a lot of people very quickly. You just have to have the ability to get a bunch of people to want it and to look at the video. What else? Who else wants to go? How about Joanne? I liked what you said with CVS Health, and I think it gave a little bit of insight into the concept of A/B testing. So would you mind talking us through what you wrote?
Yeah. So for CVS Health, like we have like CVS Pharmacy and like Caremark and all of that, but I just focus on like the pharmacy aspect of it, where they use like trial and error in order to determine like what was best for the patient. So essentially, when patients are prescribed medication, some like when they get their prescription, it might be timely or untimely, depending on like their circumstances, if they're able to get to the pharmacy and pick it up. So CVS has a delivery service for folks. And then now they also have another service, which like they prepackage like all of their medication into like little pouches. So patients already like, they know like it's like dated and everything. So they can like take it at a certain time on a certain day. And that's also delivered to them.
Yeah, and so this is an interesting example for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a big company that's trying to innovate within the company, which is often very hard, but it is very similar to a lot of the challenges that if you're an entrepreneur on your own, you're going to have as well. And what they, a lot of what Joanne was talking about is having these labels and the ability to try to innovate on a very small scale to get patient compliance up. And because they have such a broad network, they can actually test different versions and see which ones work better. So that the idea behind that, it's called alpha beta testing, where you basically put 2 or even more versions of a product in front of people and see which ones work better. Facebook does this all the time. With any new feature that Facebook rolls out, they will only give that feature to maybe a region or a certain subset of their users, and then just see, does it accomplish what they want it to accomplish? And if it does, then they start to roll it out to the other regions. But if not, then they just kill it. So it's sort of the idea of not trusting like who's the smartest or even the loudest person in the room, what they say, but just trusting what the customers say with their actions. And that's a big principle behind lean operations, as well as agile product development, which we're going to talk about today. It's not trusting what you all say internally, but figuring out very quick ways to get answers from the customer, and ideally answers that are based on their actions in how they use your products. Okay. What else? I think there were 2 that were sort of not your typical MVPs, right? These are big products, and this was Michael and Tristan. You're sort of thinking big vision. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what your MVP ideas were.
So my idea was, if I put myself in the shoes of Elon Musk and without all the money he had, I would basically start off with a rechargeable AA battery and sell that to the customer on the condition that they give me feedback on the product, whether it be battery performance, the actual charger performance, and slowly as it grows, I would get more feedback, improve my prototype, be able to build a better battery, and hopefully grow that into a car battery which I can then do kind of a similar process with maybe hybrid or electric car manufacturers, and eventually work my way up to build my own electric car.
Yeah, so it's a great example of thinking small in product development in order to become big, right? So it's like not starting with maybe an electric car that runs on just a regular AA battery and just doesn't work, but instead trying to figure out how about a AA battery that maybe controls a remote control car or something like that, and then working your way up bigger and bigger with each iteration until you're starting to power real life cars. And so that's an interesting way to think about it. And it's funny because it's so similar to what Elon Musk wanted to do, although he started with millions and millions of dollars. His idea was, can we get rid of fossil fuels and have the world powered by electricity? But the idea of like, where do you even start with that is just kind of crazy. And so he started with, well, let's make some really cool looking cars and have people obsessed with a car company. And then from there, we can go on to some of these bigger and better things. So I don't think he ever intended to be sort of the world's richest car dealer, but it was a path on the way to really changing the way that we use energy. Michael.
Yeah, so what I did was I selected Mazda, mainly focusing on their rotary engine cars, their RX series, which is a kind of a really big step outside of normal engine cars. So it's basically with like a completely different design for that. And so my initial approach was to maybe have it more a small scale production and like a sports car, and then making sure like selling it with features like more basic features, like not very fancy. With being a car, people want a certain amount of reliability, like given that it is a big amount of money that they're putting towards it. And so aside from that like base reliability, I would kind of play around with the different features as in terms of different options and like nicer materials and stuff like that. But then I would kind of rely on just the fact of how different these cars are to kind of drive early sales and have people try to overlook their more basic early stages, and then kind of build off of that to actually start making money to put back into the cars to make them like higher end or I don't know.
Yeah, and I like this example because it's sort of the way other end of an MVP, right? It's like you're actually sticking with a car, right? You know, you're not going down a car battery, it's sticking with that car. And there can definitely be MVP principles applied to that sort of manufacturing. And the example that I gave in my response to your submission was Skunkworks. Does anyone know what Skunkworks is? Anyone want to talk to that? Yeah, Michael, why don't you talk through that?
If I remember correctly, it was kind of a group setup. I think it was during the Cold War. And then they were like mainly like a group of engineers just set on making like, I think it was like special types of planes to like, I think it was spying over the Soviet Union. And they like came up with different planes. I think the main one was Blackbird.
Yeah, so this was a division of Lockheed that was being tasked with sort of doing the impossible and coming up with this plane that no one thought was possible to build. And what they did is they gave all the power to their engineers, and they decided, you know, we don't think this is going to work anyway, but the only way it will work is if we take away all bureaucracy. And so they gave the power to these people to just really build whatever they want. And by removing a lot of the red tape, the approvals, and just being able to sort of build things that maybe would have taken an entire year of approvals just to get through like a specific part of the engine, they were able to do within a matter of weeks. And they ended up with some of the greatest innovations up until that point. And that way of working has become a big philosophy of even these huge government contractors, where you'd think they're just dealing with all kinds of red tape, but they're still trying to apply principles from that are covered in the lean startup. So everybody's trying to be lean. Everyone's trying to follow this principle of, you know what, as Mark Zuckerberg says, move fast and break things. I think that's a principle that's being applied everywhere. And obviously in healthcare, if you can't break things because that might kill someone, but iterating very quickly so that you can get that customer feedback, rather than trying to come up with a perfect product on release 1. So that's something that a lot of people are starting to embrace. And I'd like you all to really take that principle to heart as you're building your prototypes, and not try to get it perfect right away, but try to get it out there fast so that you can share it with potential customers. And we'll talk about user testing at a later lecture, because you'll find that the feedback that you get during that user testing is probably going to drive more of your work than the work that you just create out of, okay, well, what features do I want? Because you're going to really get a better opinion, an unbiased opinion, more importantly, about what needs to happen with your product. Okay. There were also a couple of answers, not around starting small in terms of product, but starting small in terms of market. And John, I think you had a good answer on that.
Hi, so I chose Uber. You may not have heard of it, but it was ride hailing through, it's on-demand ride hailing through an app. Yeah, I chose a small area to start with. So say like one city that would be like in service and have like a limited amount of drivers to test it. And so whatever early adopters used it, there was, I guess, only a few drivers that could, I guess, pick them up. And so start small, and then as there's more users, there's more drivers, and then expand out and become like regional. And then now today it's worldwide and thousands of drivers and drivers' rights problems, but that's something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the advantage here is you have a market that you can win. It's like, if you want to beat Uber, good luck. But maybe you can beat Uber in Claremont, or maybe just your street, right? Maybe you want to control all, maybe you think you have a next generation version that you think would work really well, and you just get your neighbors to use it, and they already have that loyalty to your brand. And so it enables you to really win, at least within that small scope. And then maybe in the course of actually having real customers that are using your version of Uber, you really hit on something, and then that becomes something you can expand to your larger neighborhood, and then maybe your city, maybe your state, and then you go from there. Uber just started in San Francisco, which is obviously a larger city, but they had all kinds of problems. I don't know if you'll have been in San Francisco pre-Uber, but it's almost impossible to get a cab. The situation was horrible. And so they had a lot of ready-made customers that were just ready for anything that was different from what they were currently using. Facebook, another good example, where they started with Harvard, right? So it's just, he doesn't know how to make a social media app for the entire world right on day one, but he thinks, well, maybe I can get my classmates to use it. And then, oh, maybe I'll get my whole school. Then maybe I'll get a bunch of schools. And then now Facebook's obviously way beyond just schools, for better or worse. Another aspect of this that's interesting is that when you start with a small market, you can control more of the operations, right? And that's, I think they covered it in the reading of sort of the behind the curtain or Wizard of Oz phenomenon, where it looks like the app is doing this magic stuff, but it's really just you and your co-founders that are doing everything manually. And Angelo, I think you talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, I did. So like the company that I talked about was Amazon. So I was trying to think of a way that Amazon would have an MVP, and I was thinking of like maybe if you're the CEO of the company, that CEO can like take pictures of different products that people would probably be interested in, and then like upload the pictures of those products onto their company website and advertise it as like a selling product. Like there might not even be like a quick buy button that Amazon has now, but like just like a description of how to contact them. So if they're interested in buying the product, and if like the company, if the CEO received like an interested customer and they want to buy the product, then the CEO has to like, get the product from the store, like and then ship it to that customer by himself, like pretty much like manual work. Like there's no product search catalog, no tracking system, no warehousing or any automated options, just like a bare bones of a website. And that's pretty much it.
That's how so many startups begin, right? I don't know if does anyone watch Shark Tank, and people are always selling some product that they made that usually has gotten a little bit of success. And I guarantee you, over half of those people, you go into their house and their house is probably filled with boxes, right? Because like they're their own warehouse, and that's just the way you got to start. Is you got to hustle and you've got to really come up with ways so that you don't have to pay other people to do things for you, right? And some of that is not glamorous at all. If Jeff Bezos was doing what you described now, well, he probably would have died years ago out of stress, right? But to get that off the ground, you kind of have to start with that, and then that gives you the cash flow to be able to start paying other people or paying warehouses to take care of some of the nitty gritty for you. The other nice thing about being sort of the person behind the curtain is that you get a lot of very close interaction with the customers. If you outsource right away, you don't really know what's the tone of the customers when they're complaining, right? Or what are they interested in? What are they complaining about? If you get that in a spreadsheet versus you're the one picking up the phone and hearing it, your sense of your customers is not quite as solid. And so that closeness and being able to understand and empathize with what your customers are going through is really the most important thing for being successful in a given business. And so with that, I think that takes me to the last two, which are, I think it was Maria and Alana. You talked a little bit about like focus grouping and getting it in front of the customers. Could you talk to your ideas? I think Maria's actually not here yet, but Alana.
Yeah, so I chose a company and software called Alfred. And for those of you who don't know, Alfred's basically like an application launcher for Macs. And it's very similar to Apple's Spotlight feature on Macs. And so I basically said that the model for this would be essentially providing the software to other YouTubers or content creators to understand their feedback on software technology like this. So then from there, they can advertise it to their followers or other people in their circle. And so that allows for quick user feedback, and it'll, I guess, entice other people to purchase the product as well.
Yeah, yours was actually the only submission, one that I hadn't heard of, and then two that convinced me to maybe want to get it. I use Spotlight all the time, and so I was thinking, maybe I need to check out Alfred. And I think that your strategy really accomplishes two things, right? It's one, you learn so much more about your product by getting that in front of other people. And then two, that's step one of marketing. And there are some companies that if they're good enough, and it sounds like maybe Alfred is one of these, I think Discord's another, where they don't really spend anything on marketing. And the marketing is just word of mouth from some of these influential people that they get their product in front of. Now, it can backfire when you do that too, because you don't control them. They don't work for you. And they might say that your product is terrible, right? And of course, there's going to be that hesitance. Everybody's always hesitant to get that product out there to the first person, right? It's always nerve-wracking. And one quote that a lot of successful entrepreneurs say is that if you're not at least a little bit embarrassed at your first product launch, you release too late, right? And so getting that out there to some of these customers can really make you feel vulnerable. But it's really the only way to get that out there and to start improving and iterating upon it. So I think you guys pretty much covered all of these questions. The only thing that I really would like to emphasize, and I'll throw this question out to you all, is why release an imperfect product? So like I just said, that being a little bit embarrassed, what's the point? Why would I want to intentionally embarrass myself and potentially tarnish my reputation or my company's brand by releasing an imperfect product?
Find out if the customer, or like what the customer really wants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So like if you release like a imperfect product, you can see if there's an actual like target customer base that will, want your product. And so you don't have to waste time on making this product if nobody wants it, and you can start over again and see what the customers really, really want.
Yeah. Who here thinks that you could create a perfect product on your own? I'm actually keeping my hand up because there have been times where I've thought that I could, right? Or I've thought that, you know what, like I'm probably the best to create this. And it's just never true. And even if you're saying like, you know what, there's no way, there's always that feeling. And who here's a perfectionist? Let me ask it another way. Right. So there's always that feeling, especially among those who are perfectionists of, well, I got to get it perfect first because I don't want to release something that's imperfect, and that would be embarrassing. And you know what, I really do. I put forth pretty good product. I mean, you're all in graduate school, so you're all already on sort of the most educated quartile of people around here, and so like, why not you, right? But the answer is that even the smartest person in the world doesn't have the right version of their product until they put it in front of customers. That's the only way, and multiple customers. So it can't even, you might be the perfect customer for your product, but until you put it in front of other users who might be similar, but a little bit different tastes than you, you'll never get that product to be where it needs to be. So it's really starting that process of iteration. And by the way, it's that first release that's always the hardest. So getting that out there early and just biting the bullet, it's like a Band-Aid, just pull that off, will be very important. And so when we start our prototypes, I really would like to get that in front of other people as quickly as possible, just to get their thoughts and to do some user testing. Okay, any other questions about the reading or what it means to build an MVP? Because this is essentially what you're going to be building.
Yeah, I just had another kind of quick question. I mean, couldn't you make it a little bit more perfect by doing a lot of market research and just kind of figuring out what the customer wants and needs before you actually release it, and not just kind of start gambling on a product release?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's actually something that's covered in other chapters of the Lean Startup, the importance of market research and making sure that it's still a similar principle, right? Of it's not you in a room trying to figure this out, but it's you getting on the phone with actual customers. And that still is putting your idea out there though. It's like you haven't figured out all the answers yet. You don't know how to answer every question, especially if you're talking to doctors. They don't have a lot of time and they might be testy with you. So it's like not being afraid to have some of those conversations where they might say, you know what, this is trash, I don't have time, go away, right? But instead having those conversations, maybe getting the door slammed or the phone hung up on you a few times so that you can truly understand what they need, right? And by the way, getting hung up on is information, right? It's being able to know, okay, well, they didn't really like when I said that I was going to automate some part of their job, right? So how can I make sure that this is less intimidating and more cooperative with them? Because if someone is afraid of what an innovation, as useful as it might be, is going to make them obsolete, then that has actually prevented products from succeeding. Sometimes products have been almost too good. I hate to say it, but it happens in healthcare. Okay. Any other questions? All right, let's move forward. So stages of web design. You are at stage 2. So stage 1 is that back of the napkin idea. Now you all didn't sketch it, but I would say that this was what we talked about last week before you started the mockups. It's that user story, sort of, this is something that is needed in the world. And this is the spark that is making me want to pursue it further. And so it's something that you could essentially share that napkin with someone with the sketch, and they could say, oh yeah, I get that, right? And that might be an even earlier version of the video that some of you all talked about. It's just a sketch and then sharing that with people and getting their thoughts. After that, there's the wireframe. So that's what you're working on right now. And these stages, and I talked to this a little bit last week, but they start with low fidelity. So not a lot of detail, just the basic idea. And then with each layer, as we climb the pyramid, they're moving to higher and higher fidelity. So next level of fidelity is the wireframe, where we don't care about colors as much. We don't care about the details of the images that we're going to put on the site, but let's look at what the functionality is going to be that will accomplish that user story or that grand idea that I might have had at stage 1. Once we've built that wireframe, we move up to a mockup, which is a more visual representation. Sometimes this is more for the artist. So you get a designer involved and they give an idea of what this look of the product is going to be. What color schemes am I going to use? Are there any provocative images that I want to use? What is the theme? And that will be a reflection of my users that I want, right? If I want my users to be maybe older, maybe family people, maybe they're parents of children, then they're going to be probably a little bit more friendly. Or if I want a younger college age demographic, then maybe it'll be a bit sharper, look more cutting edge. So these are all decisions that I would make in this mock-up stage. And then number 4, which is where we're going to get at the end of the class, this is the prototype phase, where I have something that actually functions, people can use. Maybe even it's a product. They say a prototype becomes a product when you have a paying customer. So a customer that likes it so much that they're willing to cross the line from a free customer to a paying customer. Okay. Here's the sketch. And the idea with the sketch, and we're going to use Amazon as an example as we move from sketch to prototype. And so the idea here is that you're going to communicate the basic principle of what you're trying to build and why it's worth building. So in the case of Amazon, this is Jeff Bezos's famous flywheel, where what they're saying is by having a lower cost structure, so they don't have to support stores and these huge sort of brick and mortar networks, they're able to charge lower prices. And that leads to a better customer experience, which leads to more traffic, which gets more people who want to sell their products onto your platform, which increases selection, which then improves the customer experience even more. And so all of these feed into each other, and they call it a flywheel again, where it keeps moving and each aspect of that wheel feeds upon the next. And so this was his original idea that led to the biggest company in the world. So the idea is just to explain the crux of your idea, both visually and simply. And so I think the examples that you all gave with the videos were good examples where you sort of have this idea that stands alone. You don't need a prototype to say, you know what, if we're just selling DVDs or renting them out through mail order, that's a better experience than Blockbuster. And it's actually similar, coincidentally, but similar to this, right? Where because I don't have to support all these stores, I have a lower cost structure, I can charge less, better customer experience, more customers, more people who want to put their DVDs onto my site, better selection, so on and so forth. So they don't all have to look like this, but this is just an example where you're not showing the site at all. You're really just showing the business model, right? What's innovative about your idea? Okay, any questions about Sketch? So Wireframe, you all saw this in the last lecture and you all have been creating these. So what you all have sent me looks a lot like this, which is pretty cool. And this is just the structure of the content. So it's the best way really to show how a feature is going to work, because oftentimes when I'm thinking about a feature, let's say the feature is drones that deliver my medication. It's like, okay, that's great, but is that going to be a product that people want to use? And if so, what will it look like while they use it? And so the wireframes give you a chance to create that user experience. So that's really what I want you all to focus on as you're building your wireframes, is the user experience. How can we make sure that there's a flow to it and that the functions that I'm trying to accomplish are doable on an easy to use interface, right? If that interface is just a bunch of ones and zeros and it takes a genius to understand, it's not going to work, right? So you got to use the wireframe to figure out, can this be, all the features I want to use be distilled into a format that the average user that I'm looking to get to use my product can understand. Any questions on wireframe? And by the way, later in the lecture, I'm going to give you all a chance to, we're going to go back into Balsamiq and give you all a chance to ask questions or ask for me to help build certain features that maybe you all have been wondering about within the Balsamiq platform. So mockup, it gets a little bit more high fidelity. Oftentimes, people will contract this out to someone. So they might, a wireframe is a typical input that you will give to web designers. And it's much better than giving them a list of sort of bullet points of, well, I wanted to do this, I wanted to do that, I wanted to do the other. If you give them a wireframe, they can easily just make that look nice. So you give them something that's like, hey, I want my products to show up like this. I want a search bar, blah, blah, blah. And then they can turn that into something that looks really nice. Okay. And then that gives you a better idea. And this is actually something that you could easily share with potential users or maybe just friends and family. Say, hey, is this something you would use? And then they might say, well, I already use Amazon, or I prefer to shop in person. And then you can talk through, well, what would we need to put in here that would make you want to use it? Okay. And then finally, prototype, you have a working platform that you can now use. And this is something that can be tested by users. You can just give it to them, and we'll talk a little bit through what user testing entails. But this enables you to push buttons and see what works, what doesn't work within your prototype. The key here is that you have buttons that actually work. You have the ability to manipulate data. So we talked about this a bit last week. It's taking inputs that are provided by either the customers or maybe their doctors or people that are around them, and then turning that into a useful output. And then the result is really a finished product proposal. So this is where I want you all to end up at the end of this class. It is something that you can actually get users to use. And maybe it's something that you want to pursue after this class. And honestly, if you have a prototype that has real code in it, you're ahead of the game. This might be something that you could pitch to an investor. So I hope to get you all there. Any questions about the phases from sketch to prototype? All right. So again, low fidelity to high fidelity. That's the key. Don't get caught up if you're at this stage 1 or stage 2 and like getting that logo perfect. We're not there yet. Right? Well, we'll have more of an idea of what that logo needs to look like once we know what the product's going to look like.
I actually have a question. I just thought of one. So what part of the stage in this pyramid does like all the code and stuff like to make it actually functional? Does that get added in that between the 3 and 4 stages? Or like when is that done?
Exactly. It's between the 3 and 4 stages. I'm not going to teach you how to use sites like Wix, but there's a lot of, they call them no code products that are out there. This is like a new wave in the world where you can create functional dynamic websites without having to code at all. And so sometimes you can just sort of leapfrog that coding step. But of course, the cost of that is that you have much less flexibility in what you can build. And they're a lot more expensive. And they're especially more expensive as you scale. Right? Their goal is to get you hooked so that you've got something that actually is attracting investors. But the only way that you can make it what it needs to be is to pay them, thousands of dollars a month to continue hosting you. So by being able to code between this 3 and 4 step, that frees you up to own your own product. And it makes it a lot less intimidating to get to the point where if you see a problem in the real world and you want to fix it, you can now fix that with a technological solution. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Another thing I would add is that if you've just gone as far as to build these wireframes, you're also ahead of the game, because you can then submit that to some development shop in India or some country where labor is not quite as expensive, and they could get you a product built for just a couple $1,000s. Now, if you don't have this wireframe, you don't really want to trust those outsourced firms because they're typically not good with innovating on their own what's going to be most user-friendly. They're just good at sort of translating exactly what you tell them. So if you're translating from words to an image, that can lead to problems and has led to problems with a lot of people that I know. But if you've got this wireframe, there's a lot less room for interpretation. And so you can potentially spend an order of magnitude less on outsourcing some of that code development. Okay. So this also speaks to a very commonly used phrase in web development, which is that premature optimization is the root of all evil. So in this case, this guy's saying, hey, can you pass the salt? And it takes forever. And it says, oh, I know. I'm developing a system that can pass you whatever condiment you want automatically. And he says, it's been 20 minutes though. And all he wanted was the salt, right? And so this is a good example of premature optimization. It's this person that is being asked to pass the salt is saying, you know what, I could pass the salt, but that's kind of boring and too manual. Let me just make something that would be perfect for giving anyone all the condiments that they want. And in isolation, that sounds like maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should build that. Why not? That could be great. But in the meantime, your customer is mad. So it's really whatever the customer wants. And then if the customer says, you know what, I love that you passed me the salt. Now I want you to pass me the ketchup 5 minutes later. And then 10 minutes later, okay, can you pass the mustard? And you're like, wow, it's driving you crazy. It's taking up all your time. That's the point at which you might want to build this arbitrary system so that your customer can get their condiments on demand. Does that make sense? So it's like, wait for reality to force you to build some sort of optimization in. In the meantime, build what the customer wants and only what the customer wants. So don't over design at those low fidelity steps. It is tempting. I'll tell you, I am tempted by this daily to try to over design. And I can imagine in my head, oh my God, this would be the coolest feature if I could put this in, but no one's asking for it yet. So it's like build what they're asking for and then work your way towards that beautiful system that could exist down the road. Any questions about this?
Yeah, so let's say you do have like that awesome feature that you want to add to your app and you said no one's asking for it. Like how long do you wait like to add that, or is that something you do with like the A/B testing? Maybe you like send it out to a couple hundred people, I don't know, to see like if it works well, like, you know, what's the timeline for that?
It's a good question. And of course, there's no real answers, but I like what you said about sending that out to people, right? So it might be your most early adopter or most advanced users that you say, you know what, this feature sounds really cool. And then try to put that out to them of, hey, would you like this? Right. And try not to lead them too much of like, I want your answer to be yes, you know, because then they'll just give you the answer that makes you happy. But figuring out a way to understand, is this something that you want? There have been examples where people have invested. I mean, Quibi is a great example, not to pick on them, but they invested a lot of money and a lot of talent into a service that it turns out no one really wanted. And so it would have been good for them to listen a little bit more to what their customers are looking for or what their potential users are looking for. I'm sure there's a world in which they could have been successful. Now, I think they were just a little bit too arrogant that, you know, these were very successful executives that had done it many times and succeeded. And so I think they thought that their opinion was more important than the opinions of their customers. They lost sight of that. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes, and this might be a frustrating answer, but sometimes the answer is just to build your system, even if no one's telling you that they want it. And I think Apple is a good example of that, right? I think Steve Jobs famously does not believe that the customer is right, because he does not believe that the customer knows what they want until Apple gives it to them, you know? And so there are examples where you're just so visionary, you're so ahead of the time that what you build is right and people just don't know they want it yet. But that's not the norm, you know? And frankly, if you're thinking like that, you don't really need this class. Like you're just so visionary about what you want that nothing's going to get in the way of you creating that. And that might lead to you being homeless, but it also might lead to you becoming one of the biggest innovators that we know, you know? So I think if you're going to take that stance, you have to be comfortable with the fact that what you do, what you spend all your time on, might fall flat or might change the world. And maybe that was a little bit of the thinking behind Quibi. You know, it's like this might just change the way that media is consumed, and we're willing to take that risk that it doesn't work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so this is another very common description of minimum viable product, which is build a skateboard. If you're trying to build a car, don't start with a wheel, because what the heck is anyone going to do with this? You know, don't start even with a wheel with an axle. Build a skateboard, because really, what do they want? And that's a key question that you're going to ask when you're doing user testing or when you're doing your market research is, what does the customer really want? You know, it's nobody really wanted streaming movies, because we didn't really even know what that was. And our experience of streaming was so poor, where it would take 10 minutes just to load a 3-minute video, that we didn't want that. How are we going to watch a 2-hour movie? We have to wait for 6 hours just for that movie to load. No one wanted that. That would have been an example. If Netflix had done streaming content right away, they'd be building a wheel, and that wheel would have been a really cool looking wheel, but it doesn't get me my movie, and it doesn't get me my movie like when I want it, you know? I think there was actually another example. Who brought up Spotify? One of you used Spotify for your lean start. Oh, that was Maria. Okay, she's not here. So she brought up Spotify and how Spotify has all these really cool features, right? So they might have a feature that's like, oops, let's go back. Like maybe this rear view tail light is like really awesome. And this is, bear with me here with this comparison, right? But it's like some of the cool Spotify features might be compared to like this tail light or this headlight or like really cool interior, or actually better yet to focus on the sports car, right? But like really cool design in the sports car. Spotify could be considered the sports car of streaming music services, right? But when they first started, they didn't have any of these bells and whistles. And they didn't just start with like one fancy wheel that just like works so much better than their competitors. What they started with was a skateboard that was super efficient. The only thing Spotify cared about when they started was, I want there to be 0 lag time when you want to play a song. That was all they cared about. They were hyper focused on 0 lag time. That's the only thing that matters. And in order to do that, they had to have a very simple platform. But once they got that, now the users are like, oh man, this skateboard is awesome. It's getting me from point A to point B. It's all I need. Well, then they started turning that into like a bike or a motorbike. And now it's finally the sports car. But the only reason they got there is because they built a super efficient skateboard at the very beginning where there was 0 lag time. So they focused in on what do they want? They want to get from point A to point B. In the case of Spotify, they want to push play. And guess what? It plays. No buffering, none of that. It just plays. And that's what made Spotify the company that they are today. Any questions about that? Did that metaphor make sense? I know it's like sort of mixing different principles, but it's really whatever that function is. And I want you to take this to heart when you're building your mockups. What is that one function? Don't spend that much time on like your login process and like, I'm gonna have all these headers and all these things that look cool. Oh, that's great. And I actually love that I've seen that on some of the mockups because it shows your ability to use the platform and to create a wireframe. But for between this week and when you present next Monday, I want you to really focus on what is that core feature? What is the equivalent of getting from point A to point B, or the equivalent of pushing play and the song plays right away without lag? What is that for your product? And how can you present that on Monday in a way that will attract the rest of the class and of course me to say, ooh, that's cool. I'd love to see that turn into a prototype, right? All right, anything else here?
Yeah, Professor, I just kind of had a question. So what kind of happens when, I mean, for the Spotify example, I think that makes sense to have it kind of build upon each other. But let's say that the number 5, the Lamborghini, is like the be all end all, and you have a smaller company that might not have the funding to be able to go through the steps 1 through 4, that they want to be able to go through the top route where they're actually just designing their product. They don't go through the MVP route.
Yeah, it's a great question that actually it does apply with a lot of medical products. And I don't want you to focus on that at all in this class, but there are examples where people are building hospital tools. So this is mainly for hospital tools. So, Justin, it's not going to apply to, let's say, dating, within the patient community or the medical community, but there are some products that want to build these like electronic health record parsers that will be used by hospital. And a lot of these hospitals, they don't want to, for security reasons, contract with a bunch of different vendors. And so they really ask for the product to be all in one. And in that sense, you kind of do need the Lamborghini. But what I would say is maybe you're building the skateboard that helps a bigger version of your product get there. You know what I mean? Like maybe you're building the skateboard within the OR and then they acquire your product and then, put that into their umbrella organization. So that's one way in which it'll work, right? I focus on clinical trial recruitment in my non-teaching life. And that's the type of thing that a lot of these hospital softwares want to work with, right? Maybe they don't want to do the recruitment on their own, but they know that they need something that can help them with clinical trial recruitment. And so they'll work with a company like mine. So does that make sense? Like, yes, the hospital might be paying the Lamborghini, but the Lamborghini needs a special kind of fuel, and so you could be that fuel, or it needs specific parts. You could be that part.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So Agile. Has anyone heard of Agile development? Okay, so you will hear about it now. And it's not just web development. And it's very much a fast rising principle that I think is now, it started in web development, but it's leaking into many other aspects of business. And it's not really, again, specific to coding. It's more of a product or project management methodology. And the idea is that we're going to break major projects into little chunks that are called iterations. And so you've heard me say iteration a few times already. This is a key word, iterations. When I say iterations, what do you all think of? Anyone want to volunteer? So what do you think I mean when I say an iteration?
Would it be like different versions?
Yeah, exactly. And who said that? I want to make sure.
Justin.
Okay, great. Give you credit. So yeah, it's different versions. And if you notice in web development, this might not be as visible to you all, but you might have seen when you're like installing the next operating system or the next browser, it'll say like Google Chrome version like 35.3.2, something like that. And it leaves you wondering like, oh my God, that's a lot of versions. And the reason is that they want to iterate constantly on top of that. They don't want it to be like Google Chrome 1, 5 years later, Google Chrome 2, and then what the heck happened between those 5 years? And how do you know that all those features that you put into Google Chrome 2 are going to work? Instead, they're just saying, you know what, every little feature, let's just release it to the public and see what works. If it doesn't work, we'll roll it back. If it does, then we know we've got something great. So iterating means that we are improving our product and releasing it to customers a lot. And does anyone remember like back in the day, like Windows XP, or even going further, like Windows 95? That might be too far back, but like they would release a product and everybody used Windows. Like Mac wasn't even that cool at the time. I think it was still cool, but like it was almost like hipster cool. Like you only liked it because no one else used it. And it was pretty much Windows was on everything. PC was just what everyone had. And every time they would release a new system, there'd always be months of people saying, oh my God, this new system is terrible. There's so many bugs. And they'd have to go in and fix those bugs. That was the old method of product release, where you wait until you think it's perfect, and then you release it into the public and they tell you how awful it is. And then you fix the bugs in hindsight. If you're iterating constantly, then it's just a little thing that you thought was perfect. And then they're telling you how awful that little thing is, but it doesn't create news stories about it. It's just like a little thing that maybe irks a few people or delights them, best case scenario, and then you can keep iterating on top of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Old version was called waterfall web development. Another major principle of Agile is that all functional groups are participating in each iteration. And this was actually, if we go back to when we were talking about skunkworks, that was a major tenet of the skunkworks. It was saying, instead of the previous version or the previous world of developing these new planes, is that management would tell the engineers, hey, we need you to invent a turbine, right? That'll work for this engine, And so they would build the turbine, and then they would say, all right, we figured it out. And they would submit that back to management, and they'd say, okay, great, we got a turbine. And then to someone else, they'd say, hey, you know what, we need like valves. So could you develop the right valves for our product? And so management would just sort of take all of these inputs and then move that forward. The idea with Agile is that that's a poor way of doing it. Instead, what you should do is have a smaller project, but you've got sort of the product managers, the engineers, maybe even the marketing team, all involved in one team so that they can talk to each other about what does the customer want? That comes from marketing. What can we do? That comes from the engineers. How does that all fit together? That comes from the product managers. And so having them all on one team enables them to always know where each other stands and to see where the constraints might be on what they're able to do. So that's another core aspect of Agile. 4 is embrace unpredictability. And this was, I think this is a huge reason why organizations to this day have problems with going from the old waterfall methodology to Agile. If you're doing waterfall, what you're saying is like, this is a 2-year project. We're going to put this amount of people on it. We're going to build all of these milestones, and we'll check in periodically, make sure that they're hitting them. If they're struggling, we'll figure out why, fix it, right? That's a very comfortable way to manage a product or a project. If you're doing an Agile, what you're doing is, okay, it's a smaller project, maybe 2 weeks, but then we're throwing it out into the wild, and who the heck knows what's going to happen, right? I'm building one feature, but then what the customers tell me might be completely the opposite of what I thought was going to be the next feature. So by listening to the customers, we actually are admitting that we don't know what's going to come next. And so that can be very difficult for some organizations, but it's really crucial for the way that a lot of, especially these tech products, are iterating and improving. And then the 5th aspect, and this goes hand in hand, is satisfying the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So if you remember the cartoon, what did the customer want in that cartoon?
Salt.
Salt, exactly. That's all they wanted. They didn't want this 2-month timeline to build this arbitrary thing. They want salt, so give them salt, right? Give them what they want quickly, and then they can tell you, hey, that's great, you gave me the salt, but I actually wanted kosher salt. I didn't want the salt that you gave me. And so then in your next project, you can very quickly get them kosher salt, right? And then they might say, you know what, this would go really well with pepper. So could I have some pepper with that? And then you're sort of doing that in iterations so that the customer always knows you're there, always knows you're listening, and you're giving them the right type of product, as opposed to they hear nothing from you for a couple months. Then you're like, hey, great, salt and pepper, but it's the wrong kind of salt, Himalayan salt or something. And then white pepper. And they're like, I didn't want this, right? You should have just listened to me. We should have been talking and going back and forth, right? So that's how that works. And by the way, when I say talking to the customer, it means you have to have this communication open to them. But the real talking comes when you release the new version and you see, are you getting the results that you want, So it's not necessarily what the customer is telling you, although oftentimes it is, but it's also, what are they doing? Are you increasing engagement? Are they using your platform more often, less often? Are they getting what they want quicker? That sort of thing, okay? So a couple tenets, iterative design, we've hit upon this, and this is really, it's breaking it into little chunks and then rolling those chunks out to your customers very quickly, as opposed to having this big upfront design. Experimentation over planning. So this is sort of that letting go of control and instead saying, you know what, we don't know what's going to happen when we throw this out to the wild, but we're going to be prepared to address it, right? And we're going to actually use what happens when we throw it out into the wild to inform our next step. Customer feedback over intuition. So again, this is sort of, we all might think that we know what's best, because especially if this is your product, this is your baby, like especially if you're an entrepreneur, you are more involved with this than anyone else. And so you might have that feeling of, well, actually, I kind of know what's best to add to this. But the idea is sort of disregarding that and saying, I have good ideas, but I'm going to always defer to my customer. And then collaborative work over one hero. So instead of this being, one engineer, one product manager, you're really working as a team. And that team is as tight as they can be during that iterative project.
Professor, how do you kind of find some of the customer feedback? Is it by sending out surveys over to kind of your existing customers? Do you monitor social media? How often, and how do you kind of sort through individuals' opinions on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm actually going to write that down so that I'll give you guys a few slides. Let's see. So how to get feedback. Yeah, so I'll cover that a little bit more, but for now, what I'll tell you is that in the scope of this class, it's going to be through user testing. So it's going to be formalized processes by which you put your product in front of a potential customer. In this case, it's someone probably that you're comfortable with, right? Friend, family member, classmate. And then you listen to them as they use your product. You watch them and you see, is it easy for them to use? Do they have any feedback? And so that's the most formal, high touch, but also everybody still does this. If you're Facebook if you're just some prototype with no customers, everybody uses user testing to improve their product. Now, there are other ways to do it too. There's surveys, sending out the video that was mentioned when we're talking about MVPs of your product and seeing how it is embraced. In addition, and this is where I mentioned you want to understand what customers do sometimes more than what they say. And this is having the key measurements within your product. And there's lots of tools that you can use for that, like Google Analytics or internal metrics, where you can see what is the engagement of my customers on my platform. Am I getting more customers? Are they staying longer? Are they more engaged when they're here? So there's all sorts of tactics that we can use to understand both what the customers tell me as well as what the customers are doing on my platform. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Great. So continuing with Agile, one of the main questions that people will ask in Agile development is, what can you accomplish in a certain amount of time? So you ever heard the phrase like, I can get you speed, I can get you cost, and I can get you quality, but not all three, right? I can only get you two. And so what Agile is saying is speed is actually the most important, the most important aspect. And in fact, a lot of the times it's also cost. So low cost, high speed, and then the customers are going to help me with the quality. And so the traditional approach will say, okay, I'm going to keep my features fixed, right? So what I'm going to end up releasing, right? That Windows XP is going to have a fixed amount of features, right? It's like now it's going to have some sort of search bar within the operating system. It'll have an upgraded suite of Microsoft Office, things like that. But time and cost, they don't really know, right? It's like we can either spend a lot of money to get out there quickly, or we can not spend a lot of money. It's going to take 5 years. And then quality is sort of stuck in between. With the Agile approach, they're actually saying, we know how much we're going to spend. We want this to only take like 2 weeks. And therefore, the amount of features that we can release in those 2 weeks, it's just going to be whatever we can do, right? So we have a good idea of standards of when we want this to go out to the customer and how much we're going to spend. And you know what, if we only get like 2 out of the 5 features, that's fine. Let's just get it out there, get it to the customer. They'll judge those 2 features and then we'll go from there. And when they judge those 2 features, we might find that the other 3 actually weren't what they wanted. And so we'll adjust when we're approaching the next iteration. Does that make sense? So it's like a given company that is developing a product, they're constantly within a certain iteration, and it never ends. It's just you're always iterating upon your product. So I'll do a little bit of comparison between Waterfall and Agile. And we'll do this visually, just that you can get a better idea of what was happening. So with Waterfall, again, it's delivering the entire enchilada in one big bang. And they call this faith-driven development because you have to have a lot of faith that that big product that you're going to develop is going to be something that works and that makes your company sort of reach that next level, right? And so the idea is that you're analyzing and planning, you're not testing in between time. And over time, you actually are taking on more risk, right? Because this is sort of sunk cost. I've devoted a lot of my people for this long amount of time. And all of the difficult decisions I made up front, right? I decided what that big bang is going to be at the end, and it's now frozen. So the longer it takes, the more I'm risking all that money that I poured into it, all those people that I poured into it. And so when that comes out, ooh, cross my fingers, right? That better work. So it's a huge amount of risk. Now with Agile, your steps you can see are much smaller. So a given step, let's say that my implementation is going to take 2 weeks, right? It's still the same looking graph, right? Where it's over time, I'm taking on more and more risk, but I'm ending it much sooner so that if it failed, if the customers don't like it, I only wasted 2 weeks of time. I only poured 2 weeks worth of money into that, right? So this whole area under the curve becomes much smaller because every time I release my product, I have a chance to take a step back and figure out, was this something that the customers wanted? And so that really de-risks my product because I'm continuously giving the customers something that they want. And when I fail to do that, I learn a lot from that. And hey, I only wasted 2 weeks, right? And so then the next time I iterate, right, my next step is going to be much more informed as opposed to in this isolation, right? These people who are working in this red part, they're not in the real world because they're not talking to customers. They're in this like fantasy project management world where as long as they're meeting their milestones, they're doing a good job and customers are nowhere in sight. With Agile, they're constantly telling you whether you did a good job, and that's constantly feeding the bottom line of your product, right? By either improving or in some cases, making your product worse. But in the cases where it makes it worse, you can fix it right away. Okay, does that make sense? Sort of why Agile is being preferred over Waterfall in terms of risk?
I had a question, Professor.
Go ahead.
Do most startup companies initiate with like the waterfall method just because they're like the first ones to kind of like delve into this? I mean, if it's like a novel product, right? Or is the purpose of the MVP allowing them to conduct the agile method even though they're a new product?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It makes me think, right? My initial instinct is to say, absolutely not, right? If you're a startup and you go to an investor and they say, what's your web development look like? And you say, oh, we're Waterfall, right? They'll say, no way, right? We're not investing, right? That's just old school, right? And that's not how we do it. However, when I think about your question, I think about the fact that when it's that very first prototype, right? You often are developing this over a longer amount of time just to get something that works at all. So that first step, and maybe a more accurate way of showing this is that maybe that first step is actually a combination of like the first three. So that first step might be more time invested, a little bit more risk because you don't know yet whether it's going to actually delight the customers or just be something that they don't want at all. But I would say that the way that you de-risk that is you figure out what you can put out to the customers in the meantime. So maybe you have your company is constantly cultivating your potential customers, right? These might be people that you just know through your friends and family or maybe your school that are interested in what your product might become. And you can continually have conversations with them to see, are you on the right path, right? Or as was mentioned earlier, some of when we were talking about the lean startup MVP ideas, there were a couple ideas that were drawing off of the Drew Houston Dropbox example where he submitted a video. So maybe you don't have a product that works yet, but as you're sort of going up this step, you're getting more and more things that you could put into that video. So I would say, yeah, send that out to the customer, because every time you do that, you're sort of moving your risk a little bit more towards this line and de-risking, right? So you always want to, of course, you got to go up, right? If up is my cost, but I also want to de-risk by getting the customer in front of my product as early and as often as possible.
Thanks.
Okay, so another way to compare Waterfall with Agile is in terms of team formation. And so this is where we talked about, it's really got to be the whole team. We're not talking about individual heroes, but the whole team is working together. And with the Waterfall approach, you really had experts that would be a part of a given stage, right? So it's like at the beginning stage, actually a good way to look at this is drug development, which is still very much Waterfall. It's like you have your preclinical, your phase 1, your phase 2, your phase 3. And the people who are involved in that stage are very different. You have your lead optimization people that this is all they do all day, every day. They're optimizing leads. They never see a patient. They're never at that clinical stage. And then you have on the other end, your phase 3 people who all they do is they see patients and they get involved with these massive clinical trials to see whether the drug works. And they often never talk to each other at all, right? And it's like phase gated, where let's say yellow is preclinical. And then once they reach that phase, or let's say yellow's lead optimization. So they found their lead, then they hand it off to blue, which is our preclinical. And then blue does their thing with the mice and whatever other animals they want to do it with. And then they hand it off to red, which is our phase 1. Red does their dose optimization, phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. Once they're done, they hand it off to teal, never to be seen again, right? And so that's the waterfall approach. It's very similar to clinical development, where you get to that next phase and then you hand it off and then you never see it again. Okay. And there's not a lot of crosstalk between the different functions. Now, one problem with this, especially in product development, is that 50%, half of all knowledge, will get lost during these handoffs, right? I'm sure you've been involved with projects where you've handed it off to someone. And it's like all that stuff that you were like just buried in terms of research or experience. You saw what worked, what didn't work. The person you're handing off to, they don't know all that stuff. And how could you even describe what it was like to be in that, And so with product development, especially, you want to have those people stick with it to the end. And so with the Agile approach, you have what are called T-shaped people, where a T-shaped person, this is breadth of knowledge, the horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis is depth of knowledge. So most people, they've got this one area in which they're really good, right? I might be really good with design, so this is me, right? But I also might be a little bit good with marketing. I might not be the marketing person, but I'm a little bit good with that. And then I just barely know like the back-end database, data scientist stuff, right? So I'm a T-shaped person. I'm really good at something, but I dabble in some of the other areas. Now, the idea with Agile is that you have a bunch of T-shaped people. And even if someone like really only knows one thing, they don't know some of these other things, just by virtue of working in these multidisciplinary groups, they start to become more familiar with the other areas. And so their other areas of knowledge become a little bit deeper. Does that make sense? Whereas with Waterfall, they really only have the T. You don't have these areas that are sort of, or actually they're more like an I, right? They don't even branch out. So it's sort of like lead optimization, day by day, year by year. I'm really good at lead optimization now, but I don't know anything about clinical trials. I don't know anything about even preclinical, you know? So it just, by virtue of working in these multidisciplinary teams, everyone's sort of learning what the other departments do, and that makes it easier for them to work together. The final thing here, and this speaks to iteration, I really like this graphic, which is learn, build, measure. So just keep doing that. This is an iteration, right? So I learn about something by measuring how my customers are working with it. So I'm learning from my customers. Then I'm going to build something based off of what I learned. And then I release that to customers, measure their reaction, learn again, build again, release that, measure, learn, build. So I just keep going over and over and over again. And that's the Agile workflow. Okay.
Professor,
go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the Agile approach. Sometimes there is a problem though, because a lot of different teams might have their own kind of culture, their own personalities, and sometimes that might not mesh with other teams or personalities. How does that kind of play into consideration?
So it definitely, Agile, for all the things that people say are good about Agile, and really the current mentality, and I hate groupthink, so I would always encourage you to challenge the current mentality. But right now it's that Agile is just the way to go, right? You're listening to your customers and all that. But all that said, it's messier. It is definitely messier. And by putting these groups together that might not mesh well, engineering and sales, historically, they never mesh well. They're completely different people, personality-wise. And so to put them in the same group could be a recipe for danger, right? And it definitely is, as opposed to keeping them separate in the more traditional approach. However, what I would say is that by dealing with that potential conflict, you're actually learning and you're becoming more effective as a company. Whereas if you keep them siloed, they'll never learn from each other. Their cultures will continue to diverge to the point where it's almost like they're two different companies, and you have to keep them on different floors. Otherwise you end up with huge fights. You know what I mean? So it's sort of, you could avoid the conflict, and a lot of companies do that. But there's a lot of benefit to be gained from having them talk to each other, because ultimately an engineer will never understand the customer as well as the salesperson. There's just no way. The salesperson, every day, they're talking to many customers, right? And the salesperson will never understand the product as well as the engineer. And so they need each other. So they need to be on speaking terms.
Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. And to push back a little bit, would it almost take extra amount of time and effort for a salesperson to train or to be able to kind of interact with an engineering person? And although it kind of might affect the cohesion, it might lengthen the timeline. And when you're kind of thinking about innovating a product, isn't timeline really important and having a quick kind of turnaround?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I will say though, in Agile, it will never lengthen the timeline, because Agile is so focused on having a fixed timeline. It's whatever you can get done in those 2 weeks. Now, you might have certain projects that don't push out much after 2 weeks, and so it might impact your actual output in a sense, which ultimately impacts your overall timeline because your company is not developing as quickly. But the alternative is that you end up with a system that is not a reflection of your customers, and you could even get philosophical with like governments, right? It's Agile is a little bit more democratic, whereas Waterfall might be a little bit more authoritarian, right? So it's sort of like you can move a lot quicker if you control everything. And there's definitely, it's not black and white that one approach is better than the other. But of course, when you control everything, what you give up is a true reactivity to what's happening on the ground. Everything's being decided from sort of the metaphorical ivory tower. You know what I mean? And so
yeah, that makes sense. Appreciate it.
Trade-offs. And right now, the mentality is very much, we need to be close to the customer. We need to be listening constantly. Now, I will say that the more your product is fully understood, and this is not tech, and it's definitely not health tech, you know, the more you need to be listening to the customer, the more you need to have that ear to the ground, so to speak, to understand what's going on. If you're, if it's something that is just tried and true, it's been working for years, and you just want to build a better mousetrap, sort of that sort of thing, then maybe Waterfall approach is the best approach, because there are less assumptions. You feel like you fully understand your customer, and you just need to build something better. And
that sounds good. Yeah.
Some projects are inherently more like, you know what? We know what we need to do. It's just really hard. And in that case, Waterfall might be a better approach. Other approaches are, we know what the problem is, but how to solve it, like there could be a million different ways. And in that case, you really want to be understanding the needs of the customer and using Agile. Okay. So this slide is a little bit more talking about the actual implementation of Agile. So we talked about the principles already. Let's talk a little bit about how do you actually use Agile. There's a couple principles. One is product backlog. And when we talk about product backlog, we're really talking about, do you remember when you created your user stories and you created a list of functions that satisfy those stories? That's your product backlog. So it's sort of all the different functions that I feel that I need to build based off of my customer's needs. And the product owner will own the product backlog, and they'll also rank it. So you'll have a meeting within your team, and you'll figure out which are the ones that are the highest priority. And that's going to be based off of what the customer is telling me, as well as sort of what's doable. You know, sometimes things are really needed, but maybe you got to do a bunch of things before you even get to that point. And then they'll use that as the sort of feeder into the Agile iterations. So an iteration is accomplished by a Scrum team. And I don't really know why they call it Scrum, but this is basically your small group that will accomplish the task that needs to be accomplished. And so here they say, this is the awesome cross-functional team that is co-located. Oops, post-COVID, not really quite as possible. But the idea is like they're very close to each other. They understand each other. They're breathing down each other's necks. So however much you can do that on Zoom, with a mandate to be able to make decisions on the business and user value. And this is another important aspect of like, why do you need to have the entire cross-functional team together? And it's because if you're missing someone that's important for the rollout of the product, you could create something that you're like, this is great. And then it gets to that person and they become sort of a gatekeeper, and they say, you know what? No, it's not going to fly. And they can really stonewall it. If everyone's in the same room as you create it, then that whole risk is completely taken away, because we're all in it together. We developed this together, and we're going to roll it out together. So in this case, they had a product owner, sort of like your product manager, your user experience person. This is like your designer, Agile coach. So this sort of, if you need like a facilitator to teach you the principles of Agile, it's very common. And then you have your developer who's doing like the fancy data stuff. And then your testers who are getting that out there to your customers. A Scrum Board this is another thing that a lot of people will use in Agile. And I'm going to create templates for you to use while you're creating your prototypes. And the idea here is that you're taking the items from your product backlog and then saying, okay, I would really love to get like these 3 things, let's say, done during my sprint. And then the sprint, remember how I said that an Agile iteration has a fixed timeline? So a sprint will be that timeline. So it's usually around 2 weeks. So a 2-week sprint, I'm going to say, I want to get these 3 things done in this order. So again, fixed timeline. If I don't get these 3 things done, I only did 1, then that 1 thing is the only thing I'm going to roll out to my customers. And then these are all driven by my user story. And then I'm creating sort of my tasks based on that. So I've got my priorities, and then each of these, typically they're like Post-it notes that I'll have in my office, where I'm saying like, okay, in order to build, let's say it's like a location finder to get medications delivered to someone by drone, I need to like first implement a map. Second, I need a way to understand where people are, right? Third, I need to understand like where my drugs are. And then fourth, I need to match those drugs with people so that I can create this interactive map where people can find the drugs that are closest to them and get them delivered. So that's what I do on this Scrum board. Sprints. So these are really, they call it like an Agile Heartbeat. And the reason is because it's this constant fixed time interval heartbeat of my product development organization, right? And the idea is that on any given time, I understand what am I rolling out every 2 weeks or every sprint? How many products am I getting out there to customers, and how much am I finding out when I do that? And the way that we keep an eye on the sprints is through these daily stand-ups. So the daily stand-ups, these are a way for us to review, okay, where are we within our sprint? How are we doing? What are we going to get out? What have we learned? Do we need to make adjustments? So again, Agile, it's unpredictable. It's all about making adjustments as needed. And then we also review sort of like, how are we doing according to goal? And then we also have this sort of working agreement that, one, we want to always be delivering to please our customers, but we also understand that that process can be unpredictable and frustrating as we do it. So it's sort of this infinite loop of constantly like, we don't know what we're doing, but we're learning, to we're delivering stuff that makes the customers happy, we make money, then they tell us, oh, we need this other thing, we don't know how to do it. And it just sort of keeps us in this constant loop that happens to follow our sprint heartbeat. Okay, any questions about that?
Professor, I have a quick thought about why it would be called a scrum, because isn't it in rugby, it's called a scrum when like they're head to head. So
Yeah.
it would probably be like cross-functional teams when one team is headed against the other, and just, I don't know, different roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, that could definitely be it. And how you're sort of in a scrum. I don't know if you all have seen a scrum, but it's sort of this funny looking thing where everyone's like interlocked. You've got, it's like just everyone's locked in as one big blob, right, with a bunch of legs, and they're all trying to push against each other to move the ball forward. And yeah, I could see that. And it's definitely like everyone's breathing down their necks. They're much closer than they might be comfortable being, but it's moving the product forward. Okay, so again, we talked about this a little bit. And I want to get you to your break. But the sprint backlog, did anyone have any questions about this? It's basically sort of taking our functions that come from our user stories, right? The functions that satisfy those stories. We're ranking them by difficult to complete. And then we're also sort of rolling them out throughout our sprint. And there's also this calculation we can do when we're doing our sprint, which is called the daily velocity, which is basically how many difficulty points are we pushing out there to customers per unit of time. So if we have a sprint that maybe we thought we were going to get like 6 points of difficulty and functions out there, we only got 2, we can start to ask what's wrong, right? So we can not only, in an agile standpoint, really learn whether our features that we're rolling out are good by getting them from the customers, but by having these constant iterations, we can understand internally, are we working together well, right? Do we need to do something to improve our productivity? And it's much easier to do at the end of a sprint, which is every 2 weeks, as opposed to maybe 6 months into a 2-year project. Okay, let's get started again. Welcome back. So I'm going to talk through a few basic principles of web design. And then once we get through that, I'll open it back up into the balsamic wireframe. And then I'll enable you to ask me questions about things that you might need me to walk through. I think a lot of you are in really good shape, though. I really like the drafts that those of you who have sent it out to me have sent. I would also encourage anyone who hasn't done it yet. It's not really, I'm not grading it or anything. So just send me a link so that I have it. And then once I have that, I've made a comment on everyone's wireframe that I've received so far. So it's a good way for you to get started on getting the right feedback so that when you end up presenting it next Monday, you get an A, right? I think that's probably your best path to an A, is getting all the kinks out between you and I so that you've got something great coming into the presentation on Monday. Just one logistical question. When I've made comments, I've been trying to call out your email in the comments. Does it automatically notify you? Can anyone? Okay, great. So you all get sort of like the Google Drive notifications when I do that. Okay, cool. So I will continue to use that method when I'm making comments. Okay, so visual hierarchy. When we say hierarchy, we mean that there's actually a few layers of principles that really are broadly adhered to when it comes to web design. So the first is layouts. So this is just the overall way in which our page is laid out. Second is color. So this is talking about, generally, do we have a coherent color scheme that we're using for our web design? After that, there's contrast. So this is, okay, well, within that color scheme, do we have the right contrast? Because contrast really drives user attention, right? We tend to look at things that are higher contrast with each other. If they're lower contrast, they tend to just sort of camouflage within the screen. Fourth is typography. So making sure that we're using both the right types of fonts as well as the right sizes of fonts, and using that properly. So using big fonts when we want to really bring attention to an overall theme, and then smaller fonts when we have more to say. But we don't really care about people's attention being drawn towards those words. And then spacing. So understanding that white space is also a design decision. And it's not something that is just there to be filled. And here it's using white space to our advantage, or at least using blank space to our advantage so that we're not overloading the user with content. If the user goes to your website or your web app and it looks like the first page of Moby Dick, then they're going to be maybe less interested in moving forward, unless what you are writing is super interesting, right? So if that's sort of what you believe the value add is the content of what's in there, then there's ways to leverage that in a way that will make your product usable. Otherwise, use white space to your advantage. Okay, so in terms of layout, there's really two major patterns that are being used. There's the F pattern and the Z pattern. The F pattern is more if you are creating that engaging content, but there's a lot of it, right? Maybe you're writing short stories, or in the medical context, it's maybe the long descriptions of the diseases that someone thinks that they might have, where they're actually actively looking for information. If it's a dating app, maybe it's the description of the person who's created a profile. So they want all this information, And so they're willing to go through the process of reading it. F pattern tends to be the most effective way to lay that out. So in that case, you can look at the F as they're going to be going down. Everyone always goes down on a website, right? Top to bottom. But along the way, they keep going out. So it's sort of understanding that they're going to go down, but out each time. Okay. And that's the F pattern. It's for when you have lots of content, information heavy, and you also want to be able to control the user journey. So understand that that F pattern is the way that they're going to be reading. Their eyes are going to be moving in that pattern. So you can take advantage, right? Maybe on the right side of the page at the end of this offshoot of the F, maybe I've got something that I really would love them to click. So understanding that that's how their flow is going to be. And so I can put little goodies at the end of the F, right? So that I can get them to do things that might be advantageous. Next is Z patterns. So if my app is a little bit less information heavy, but I want to control the way that a user is intaking a smaller amount of information, we typically understand that they're going to be looking through the site in a Z pattern. So again, it's top to bottom, but what they're going to do is on the top, they're going to go all the way, and then they're going to sort of skip down and then move forward. So this is for like a minimalist design where I want them to sort of read the issue and then call them to action. And this is also helpful when we're guiding someone through features. And I'll show you examples of how these patterns look in real life. So here's an example where we have this chiropractic website called The Joint. And in this case, there's a lot of information that they want the user to be able to read. And so you can see how they laid it out in this sort of up to down, but then left to right. And oh, looky here, the very first left to right, they left a little goodie at the end of that pattern, right? So here they're saying, hey, you can do your initial visit for only $29. Give me your information. What do you think for this website? If let's say they've got, a bunch of users visiting every day, what do you think they want those users to do? Do you think they just want a bunch of users, or do they want those users to do a specific thing based on this layout?
I think they want them to sign up for like their first appointment.
Exactly. And where is that? Basically right here, right?
Yeah.
So it's like they've left a little goodie of the call to action that they want. You could read it, you could be convinced, but then you could leave. And that doesn't do them any good because they never know who you are. So what they want you to do is fill in this form that says your name, email, clinic nearest you, blah, blah, blah. So they've planted this right at the end of an F, right? Facebook, their homepage, is an example of a Z pattern. So what they've got is at the very top, they understand that you're going to read that top from left to right. And so look here, they want you to be able to fill in your information right at the end of that. But then they understand that you're going to sort of jut back and forth in this sort of zigzag pattern. So they've planted stuff that goes here, then read some of their call to action. So it's like on the top, if I'm already a user, okay, well, you don't need to read this. So let's just catch you here so you can log in. If you're not already a user, you're going to keep going in this Z pattern. So they say, oh, okay, I can see photos and updates of my friends. That's cool. I can share what's new with my friends. That's cool. And I can find out more about what I might be looking for with Facebook search. So now I'm convinced I want to sign up. So they place the sign up call to action at the end of this zigzag. Does that make sense? So it's sort of, they understand that if you've got a lot of information that you're looking to consume, so this might be a patient who just got a diagnosis and wants to learn something, then you can follow this F pattern where it's sort of keep going down and you go to the right and know that you can insert your call to actions at the end of these little F nodes. And then with something that's less information intensive, but you just want to convince someone to start using the platform, know that their eyes are usually looking in this Z pattern. So that's how you can lay out your trying to sell them on your platform and then getting them to do a call to action. Okay. Okay, so the next layer is color theory. And the idea here is that we have certain warm colors and cool colors. And we actually can direct the user's attention using these warm colors. And the other aspect of this is note that high contrast text will draw the user's eye. So if we're at the outer end of this wheel, we actually want to use lighter text, because the color is darker. But if we're at the inner part of this wheel, because the color is lighter, we then want to use darker text. So understand that here, we keep seeing high contrast. And so that's because the text is actually high contrast. This text will draw the user, or will draw is less, it doesn't stand out as much when I'm looking at it. When I first come to, let's say, this slide, right? So this is lower contrast. So we just have to understand that people are less likely to key in on that text, okay? So it's a good way to sort of draw people towards the parts of your site that you really would like them to see. Another aspect of color theory, if we use this color wheel, is the triad way of looking at this wheel. And the idea is that the triad colors, if they're sort of fit within this triangle, tend to be complementary. So that they're high contrast from each other. And that means that you wouldn't want to like put them on top of each other, but they could go together in a given color scheme. Okay, so 10 commandments of color theory. One is just know the color wheel very well. Do you know what each color signifies? And these are some lists, like, red is sort of energy intensity, whereas green might be more freshness, safety. So try to use a color scheme that fits the mission of your particular company. Try to make sure that your colors match each other. So use a complementary or matching color scheme. If it's too intense, then try to split it up. So here you can see, for instance, that this scissors is just like way intense against the blue background, so that they might not be the best complement to each other overlaid. If you need more variations, and you can actually, they say go double complementarity. So here you can see that they've picked two different pairs of colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So these are just different ways to go about using colors, okay? I won't go through the rest of these, but this is something you can reference when it comes to designing your prototype. So moving on to buttons, one nice thing to do with buttons is you can actually create depth using light and shadows. And these are all very sort of built-in features that you can use when you're learning CSS, which is going to be the next type of coding that you're going to learn about through Codecademy. And then you can also direct attention using colors. So in this case, what they're saying is it's better to have sort of a wrong button and a right button, where if you want them to click the button, you have that button more colorful than the button that you don't want them to pick. And you often see this with like the dialog windows that that pop up on your computer, where it's sort of like the OK button will be big and colored, and then the cancel button might be tiny and not as colored. Typography, the only thing I'll say here is just use clear, readable fonts. Sometimes you'll see someone's wedding website that'll have like cursive and all that. That's really the only context in which whimsical fonts work. They don't work, especially in healthcare, when you're designing your site. So I don't want to say like never do it. And it certainly can be helpful for your logo, but for the parts of your site where you're trying to communicate content, it's better to just use very clear, readable, and most importantly, non-distracting fonts. Okay. Font size, I just have some guidance, and I won't go line by line, but the only thing I'll say is that there's the concept of the body which is essentially your main text block within a website. And then you have headers, and H1 tends to be your biggest headers, whereas H2 tends to be your smallest headers, or like your subtitles. And then these are just some guidances in terms of how they should look in terms of size relative to each other on your website. Okay. And then nav bars, you really have two options. There's top and side. And now with top, you tend to be a little bit more space efficient with your nav bars, and they offer better visibility because remember, when we're looking at the layouts, it's that top that everybody sees right away. And they also enable you to prioritize. So it's sort of that item one that's up and to the left that everyone's going to see first and foremost. So you can give a more clear idea of what are the tabs that you would like them to click. Whereas this side sort of drop down, it's a little bit easier for everyone to see everything. So maybe a little bit less prioritized. And this is just based on how people tend to read websites. So a lot of work has gone into seeing where people's eyes tend to focus when they read the websites. And if you have these verticals, then each one is a little bit more equal, right? Because people are more just taking this in as a whole, as opposed to the horizontal bar, where they tend to go left to right, and they don't usually finish reading all the way through the navigation bar. With the side, you can also fit more topics, and they offer a little bit more equality, as I spoke to, about sort of there's not as much of a hierarchy between items. Okay. You can also collapse one topic into subtopics. So I think as I showed you in the example, the wireframe last week, you could have maybe item 3 be a drop-down menu that breaks out into lots of different items. So 3 might be like, choose a disease. And then when you highlight over it, it'll drop down to diabetes, heart disease, all sorts of other diseases. So collapsible navigation bars are something that I'll show you during the coding portion of the course. Also, I would really encourage you all to copy benchmarks. So these are two great sites, CodePen and Code Sandbox. You'll actually be using Code Sandbox to code your prototypes. But both of them, they're essentially, they are visualizations of code and what that looks like on the screen. And then you can see what code went into the website. Another tactic that you can use is called Inspect Element. And this works with pretty much any browser. If you right-click a site, you can inspect it and then see what code went into that site. So, I mean, you could look at Facebook and see the code that went into making Facebook. It's all public access if you're just looking for sort of the format of the website. So I'd encourage you to maybe look at your favorite design sites and do that right click and look at the code, see if you can make any sense of it based on the principles that you've learned in HTML. I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small, but you can see there's like a div element, a class, a header. These things should start to become a little bit more familiar with you as you learn more about how to code. Okay, any questions? So let's do a quick before and after. So here's an example of a site that might not be the best layout. Now, anyone want to give some feedback on this site? Things that you think they might need to change?
I think there's too much white space, and then the color, we talked about how like cool tones don't really draw attention potentially.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one. Anything else?
I feel like it just has too many things going on. It doesn't really follow the F or Z pattern.
Yeah, exactly. The layout is a little bit garbled, and it doesn't lead the user towards any sort of call to action. You have to sort of look for that. Anything else?
I think they're also using a ton of different types of text, or fonts, like especially where it says highly recommended. Like I see like 4 different fonts there, it looks like from my end.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So let's look at another version. And this was sort of following a little bit more of the pattern. So you've got sort of you're going from left to right, and then here's a call to action to call their number. It's a little bit more of a coherent and high contrast color scheme, right? Instead of having this green on gold look, you have a white text with a darker color. And then you have right below here a super obvious call to action, because what they're realizing is that, you know what, they just wanted people to sign up. And so they're saying, let's make that easy to do. So this is just a little bit of a clearer way to get the users to do what they wanted to do. Okay, let's do one more. What do y'all think of this? So this one's good, huh?
It kind of just looks unorganized, kind of, in a sense.
Yeah. Not really any pattern. I don't know what's going on here, right here. Anything else?
I don't understand what to do on this site. Like, where am I supposed to look?
Yeah, exactly. They're not guiding me towards any sort of like, what's the purpose, right? What am I supposed to be doing here? So let's look at a revised version. So here again, it's sort of following this. They have this nav bar. It's telling us what they're all about, and then you sort of can go down into their articles. So they want you to really see, okay, well, this is a safe place for happiness. And then if I'm interested, I can sort of move on to more. There's also a much more coherent color scheme here. Okay. Okay, so the wireframe presentations, the idea is that you're going to share your wireframe that you created using Balsamiq. Try to make it 10 minutes or less, although no big deal if you go a little bit over, because this is a smaller class. And then I want you to make sure that you have your user stories incorporated. That should be the first thing that you go through when you do your presentation. And then I want you to have a minimum of 5 functions that address that user story. And I want you to use sort of buttons, links, data inputs, visuals, some sort of tool that enables that function to work, right? And satisfy that user story. And then we'll end up turning those buttons into code with actual functions by the end of the class. I'd like you to use arrows to annotate what each function is doing, and then describe your use case from start to end, okay? Some people that have submitted, I think you've had like a great thorough wireframe, and I think in some of these cases, the next step then is to home in on a particular function within that wireframe, because some of these are just like, there's a little bit much for you to be able to focus on for your MVP. So you would know, if you were to develop this as a prototype, what would be that function that would really be that killer app MVP that you would then want to turn into an actual doable prototype, okay? Don't worry too much if your app requires something very complex, like a drone, or it needs to be able to intake, let's say, video from a surgery. That's not so bad. You can just assume that you'll get that data somehow, or you'll get those drones, and just focus in on what is the app that you're building. What is it going to do with that data? So if you take the fact that you can acquire that data or acquire those resources as a given, what would your app do with those data or resources? Okay. Any questions on that? So let's do a review of Balsamiq. Any technical challenges that you've had that you'd like to share, creative challenges, any examples of features that you'd like us to walk through, you'd like to see?
I do have a quick question, Professor.
Yes.
If we want to get your attention, I guess for feedback, how would we do that? Should we just like at you in the comment section of our wireframe, or how would you want us to go about it?
Yeah, I think that'll work. And if I'm not responding, send me an email to make sure that I'm getting it. But if adding is working for you, then it should work for me. Okay.
To Danny's point, can we ask for additional feedback if we correct it this week as well, or not really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to be there for you, for anyone who's got certain questions about their wireframe. And the same will go with when you start coding, right? I want to be there as much as possible for you all to be able to make the changes that you need to make. Any other questions? Anything specific to your given projects? I think, you know, it might sound like something that's like super specific, not relevant to others, but oftentimes me showing you on Balsamic could be a great way to help multiple people out. So for instance, I can pull Balsamic in, and for the rest of the class, I can just create some stuff. So what would anyone, just feel free to shout out something that you all would like to see me make, some sort of feature that maybe you've been struggling with.
Professor, maybe there's a way you can make a keyboard if you're trying to type a message to someone.
Sure. So what would that keyboard look like?
Yeah, just kind of on the bottom, like when you're looking at an iPhone screen, having the keyboard setting.
If you go to the Justin where it has like the iOS graphics, it has a keyboard in there.
Thank you, Maria.
I like it.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Helping each other out. Okay. Anything else?
I was trying to make one for, so like I would be typing in, like for mine, a patient will type in symptoms. And then you know how sometimes it'll start like auto-populating certain suggestions, like a drop-down menu. I couldn't figure out like how to make something like that.
I see. So like an autofill for a search.
Yeah, but it gives like the user like multiple different options. So if I start typing in like S, you know, different things will start popping up that begin with S and stuff like that.
Okay. So let's see. Something is actually wrong with my, oh, it looks like my plan has expired. Uh-oh. That's not good. It said that my subscription will expire in 248 days. Maybe I just need to add. Okay. All right. So, okay, could you repeat one more time? So we want to have like a text box that autofills text.
Yeah, so like it's more like a search box, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then like on Google, for example, you're typing in an address and all like the different things pop up. I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly.
I think it makes sense. So basically, you want to have this where when you type, it would start to like autofill or give suggestions.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that there's a couple ways that you could show that, right? I think one is using those vertical tabs. So you could have something like what would be an example of what they might type?
Like flu or cold, fever.
Gotcha. So let's do, like, they type fever, and then this might, be like suggestions. And then maybe it's even like not just stuff that starts with that, but things that are similar, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And then we can say here, and this isn't like the cleanest way to do it, but like the whole point of the wireframe is that it doesn't have to look perfect. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And then we would do an arrow. The text call out that would say something along the lines of, related diseases show up when user begins typing a disease symptom, right? So that might be one way to do it. Now, what I'll say is, from the coding standpoint, that actually sounds like it might be hard, but it's not that bad, because what you can do is you can just build a database of what diseases are related to each other. And then if they start typing, you can have the system understand, okay, well, I think they're typing fever. And then it can then query what diseases are related to fever, So it might bring up like COVID-19 or the flu or something like that.
Okay. Thank
Cool.
you.
Any other questions? There's other ways. If we wanted to, we could, for instance, do a checkbox group, right? That, maybe it's a bunch of things just pop up. Fever, flu, COVID-19, etc. And then you could just say, user given option to check which is as they type in their search. Right? So multiple ways to get it done.
I had a question, Professor. So for mine, you told me to dive deeper into one specific function, but I feel like on an app, it's kind of difficult to do so because you can only have so many buttons and then it'll guide you to like the next page versus like a web page where you can have multiple functions. So can you, like, based on the examples that you've already created, can you maybe like show me what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. One way to do that is to just show multiple pages. So in the case here, if the function here, in this case, this is an example of WeHealth, right? Where you're able to click on a given cause and then find health resources that are relevant to that cause. And then one feature that I might want to dive deeper into would be this Find Health Resources button. And so what I've done is I've created this arrow that then says, okay, well, when I click this, the screener actually drops down. And so the screener has a question as well as answers that I can give. And then it has even a progress bar so that I can know how many questions I'm going to be asked. And then I also just highlighted underneath this that the patient screener will show up after they click the Find a Resource button. So just to make it very clear that I'm going from here to the screener. And then on the next page, I can show that once I've completed that, it says, congrats, we found a match. And it says when a patient matches, the eligibility trial criteria for a given trial, it'll show them an image, maybe some text. I don't really care what that is at this point. And then it asks for their name, email, and phone. And then I have the chance to either cancel if I don't like it or click submit, right? Or maybe instead of cancel, I just put like not interested. You can see now these overlaps. So I just need to figure out like how they're going to fit on the page relative to each other.
So that's like your one function, even though you have like other stuff going on the home page.
Exactly. So like I could have focused on this filter, but instead I decided, you know what, I'd rather sort of figure out how are they going to find their resources based off of their answers to the screener question. You know, so in this case, I focused in on the screener and how that provides something that is of value to the patient.
I see. Thank you.
Any other questions? Or did anyone discover something as they were creating their draft that they thought might be useful for others to know? Get some participation, extra credit. All right, well, that actually frees up some time. So what I can do is actually go a little bit in the next 20 minutes into FDA usability guidance. So this is a little bit dense, but it's good to know, and it's definitely relevant for anyone who's involved with medical devices. So the FDA has traditionally, they've regulated software interfaces on devices. So when I say this, I mean like if there's a heart monitor or something that's being used in the OR that's checking out vitals, the FDA actually has jurisdiction over what that software interface looks like. And the importance of the software slide has obviously grown significantly. They've become a lot more complex. And so the amount of involvement that the FDA has wanted to have into these software sides of medical devices has grown. They like to look at it in terms of this interface between a user and a device. So a device takes inputs that it processes into outputs, right? That might be like heartbeat that it outputs into a beats per minute metric. Now, there's an interface that then enables the user to perceive that output. And then they might process that output into something that they then take action into that then feeds back into the device. So there's this constant interface between the user of the device and then the device itself. Any questions about how this graph works? Great. So the FDA classifies errors in a bunch of different ways. The first layer of classification is unintended versus intended. So a lot of the times someone can just make a mistake because of opportunities that the device enables them to make mistakes. Other times they're actually just using the platform the wrong way and they know they are. Or sometimes they're using it for a bad purpose. So the unintended mistakes are usually called just user errors. And here we talk about slips, lapses, and mistakes. So a slip means that you just weren't paying attention and you let something slide. A lapse means that you didn't remember something. And so you were paying attention, but you just didn't remember what to put. And so you made a mistake because of that. And then there's also ignorance failure, which is a mistake. So that means that maybe you weren't trained well enough. You just didn't know how to use it. This is sort of the type of problems that happen when someone who is new to a system starts using it. And of course, they tend to make a lot of mistakes out of ignorance. Now, talking through some of these common user interface errors, this interface is definitely not what we're used to, right? With like an iPhone interface or an Android interface. We've gotten so used to these beautiful interfaces. But this is oftentimes what a lot of medical professionals still have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, because their devices are really only being used on 25, sometimes even 50-year-old software. It's crazy. I mean, there's devices that are still using Windows 95, which, I mean, a lot of you probably weren't even born when Windows 95 came out. And the complexity of these interfaces tends to use to confusion or delay in use. So one of the best ways that you can prevent some of the especially unintended user errors is by making your platform more intuitive and less complex. Another common reason for user interface errors is that correcting the error is too difficult. So this is an example where it says, data entry error was detected after you had already submitted. Please contact an administrator to repair the entry before proceeding. So in this case, because I now have to get on the phone with someone and contact them and tell them about the error, I'm much less likely to correct that error, right? So how can we make that process easier? Could there be a contact admin button right here that I could then click and then they're automatically notified so that I don't have to open up an email and send it out? I might have to look up their contact information, things like that. So building in processes so that when I make an error, I know how to fix it very easily with a click of a button, as opposed to having to figure it all out on my own. Another reason for user interface errors are that obvious errors are just not corrected, right? So it's like, if I put John Doe as an email and it lets me submit, then that's sort of a problem with the system. It should know that, come on, you know that if there's no @ sign, there's no dot, it's not an email. If there's spaces, that's not an email. So that's the sort of thing that our apps should be able to catch, rather than asking the users to just input everything correctly. I'm sure you all have been saved. I know I have, trying to submit a long form and I put the wrong thing in the wrong space. And had it let me submit, that might have prevented me from getting whatever I wanted, you know, because I didn't give them the right information. So best to just stop that ahead of time. Also, sometimes the user or the user interface fails to draw attention to dangerous conditions. So in this case, it might say your order is potentially redundant. The last serological test was for hepatitis B virus. So here I'm like about to order a redundant test that the patient has already done. But if I look at this, is it really drawing my attention? Like, I know it's bolded, it's underlined, but there's probably better ways to show someone about this potential critical error. In fact, can anyone think of a better way just off the top of their head?
Better colors?
Yeah, better colors, like red, right? Or having a symbol next to that color. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the times we see that red triangle with an exclamation point to let you know that something is wrong. Also, sometimes non-critical situations are identified as critical. So in this case, it's giving me the error. And this, by the way, this is a real thing that was, there was an article called Death by 10,000 Clicks that was exposing some of the problems in the electronic medical record usage. And they were alerting anytime that you were to, I think this was like anytime that they prescribed thalidomide, which, has anyone heard of thalidomide? It's like a famous drug that caused birth defects in children. But it's a useful drug in other contexts. And every time that someone wanted to order this drug through the electronic system, it would give them an alert saying your order is potentially dangerous if given to pregnant women. In this case, the patient is John Doe. So why do I need to know that? John Doe is not pregnant, right? There's no way that John Doe is going to be pregnant. So the system needs to be a little bit smarter So you don't want to give people too many errors when the errors are not applicable. You know what I mean? So sometimes what that causes is habituation to the alert. They call that it, where it's someone is just getting the alert so often that they're just used to saying, okay, 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 okay. And they're actually not alerted anymore by the alert. It's just a bug, right? It's a hassle to them. And so they don't even read it. One way to identify the hazards in your devices is through what's called a device hazard analysis. And this is something that's required by the FDA with these user interfaces. And what you need to look at it, it's really the most important takeaway here is that you have these two axes. There's your probability of a problem occurring from remote, it's almost never going to happen, to definite, it's almost always going to happen. Then you have your severity ranging from nuisance to catastrophic, right? In the case of health, catastrophic usually means someone is like killed or there's significant harm done to them. Sometimes there's also another axis, which is extent of the problem. So is an error going to impact one patient, or is it going to impact like the entire network of patients? You know what I mean? And so what you'll typically do is you'll analyze each potential error by its likelihood to occur, as well as its severity. And then you'll create a risk matrix from this. And typically you'll come up with the total risk by multiplying the numbers. So if it's nothing, then it's a 5. And then if it's both highly probable and catastrophic, that's a 25. And then what you're able to do is sort of figure out what chunk you want to be able to mitigate. And so in this case, they're mitigating anything that's like a 15 and above. And because 15 by 3 multiplied by 5. And those are the ones that need to be mistake proofed. Okay. And there's not really any rule of thumb of like what's the threshold number at which point you have to address the issue. It's really, everything's relative. So the more issues that you do this hazard analysis on, the more you get a sense for which are the ones that stick out as the highest risk versus which ones are okay. Okay. Okay, so we covered that. And now for your assignments, I want you to complete the first 3 lessons of CSS for Codecademy. And now CSS, you've learned HTML, which covers a lot of the content, right? So how do you do a form? How do you make tables? How do you put information onto a web page? And now CSS is, how do you make that information look cool? So how do you add colors, different font sizes? How do you position different elements relative to each other? And that will help you sort of add a level of fidelity to the products that you're going to be working on. I already went through some of what I'm expecting for the wireframe mockup. I think about 80% of you have shared your mockups with me. Those that haven't, make sure you do so. And then that's about it. Any questions while we still have some time about the coding? So what you've been learning on Codecademy? Is it all pretty straightforward? Great. Do you all feel like coders yet? I see a lot of head shakes and a few shrugs, maybe. And you'll definitely get there by the end of this class. I mean, I've only taught, this is the second time I've taught this class, but from the first class, there was one student who had no coding experience whatsoever, and now she's going on to get a PhD in computer science. So it's definitely, my goal is to sort of lift the veil of coding to you so that you can see that it's not that scary. And it's definitely something that you can explore if you want to get more into it. Okay. Any other questions? All right, well, enjoy your evening and I'll see you next week.